I remember one time we were, I think both particularly down, we were sitting at a little hamburger joint about 10 o'clock at night. We'd just taken the kids to a movie and picked them up, but they wanted to get a milkshake. And Patch and I were both hit rock bottom, and this little old lady, must have been 90 years old, came up to us and said, "I know who you are. You hang in there." Yeah. It's like, okay. We're okay now. So
these are the Ramseys in 2000 talking to Fox News about the unsolved murder of their daughter. Can you imagine the Petitos cracking jokes and laughing in a similar way? Now, this analysis is essentially part 2 to our tagging along with Holly Smith, the Boulder County SA investigator, as she went into JonBenet Ramsey's room 3 days after the incident, and then getting her sense as an SA investigator of that room, especially bearing in mind the poop narrative that surrounds it.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. So we sort of ended off the previous episode with Holly Smith dealing with her saying that something that stood out to her many years later was the poignant find that there was a red satin box with what looked like JonBenet's secret stash of candy. Now, she doesn't mention in this article with Fox 31 that there was anything smeared on that box, when we know that a box was found with candy inside that was smeared. What she does mention is that she found something else in the room, something that raised an immediate red flag for Holly Smith. She says most of the panties in JonBenet's dresser, think about that, not one panty, not some of the panties, most of them in JonBenet's dresser drawers had been soiled with fecal material. It's just so hard to reconcile this little girl that you see in these pageants that is being crowned a child beauty queen, and in this beautiful house with this going on in her bedroom. And so what Holly Smith does is she brings a child psychology perspective to this case. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, I am doing an analysis alongside this one on Gabby Petito. If you haven't watched American Murder, Gabby Petito on Netflix, make sure you do. If you find this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So Holly Smith says in this Fox 31 article, she says, there is this dynamic of children, just think of those words, in with regard to the Ramsey case. There's this dynamic of children that have been sometimes soiling themselves or urinating in their beds to keep someone who is hurting them at bay. Now, although I agree with this idea of thinking about the dynamics of children, I'm not sure that this was happening in this case. I'm not sure that was the motive of the bedwetting or the fecal smearing. It seems to me to be just ordinary meat and potatoes neglect. And that's something else we can talk about. There's just been a case of a ballerina in Australia. Her name has been protected, her parents also being protected because she's a minor. But that's really an interesting case where parents looking after and paying attention to their child in a particular way can nevertheless be harmful. And perhaps that's something we need to talk about as well. The other thing that Holly Smith highlights, she says it's pretty chronic for that child, and that's with reference to bedwetting. And so one does wonder whether she knew or had information or suspected that the bedwetting was chronic in JonBenet Ramsey's case, because that is a matter of debate. Some people say, certainly Burke says, it was completely normal. He can't even remember if there was bedwetting in 1996, and whereas others say it was really severe. Now, she seems to be choosing her words very carefully, but do you see how she also includes some sort of physical evidence where she says, in addition, some sort of evidence or trauma or an allegation is associated with this bedwetting. She also says there could be an innocent explanation. To be clear, though, I think when the police called Holly Smith, they suspected that there was a possibility of a not innocent explanation. In other words, we're really dealing with the question here is, was there prior vaginal trauma going on? And I think that is what Holly Smith was really called in to investigate, right? Because, so on the one hand, Smith says there was an indication of trauma in the vaginal area. So she was alerted to this. She was aware of this in JonBenet's autopsy report, and then brought into JonBenet's bedroom, where she looked around the room and tried to almost intuit some kind of impressions of JonBenet's life. Now remember, although this is the year 2006, it's almost the 10-year anniversary, this article notes the coroner's autopsy discovered evidence investigators say indicates JonBenet suffered vaginal trauma the night she was murdered. However, this is an important point to highlight. And again, this is what the media were thinking about 10 years after the incident, 10 years after Alex Hunt had apparently exonerated the Ramseys. However, the autopsy report also describes evidence of possible prior vaginal trauma. I'm not sure if that's true. I think that is a matter of interpretation. I think that is something that is a potential interpretation. If anything, I think the autopsy report is showing that possibility, and now it's up to other investigators to investigate that idea. And that's kind of where Holly Smith comes into this whole thing. So this is clearly a question Holly considered, and one I think any investigator should consider. And I wonder what the grand jury thought about this question. And so on this question of prior vaginal trauma, the article notes experts disagree about the significance of that. It could indicate previous injury or infection, a sign of SA, or nothing at all. Let's go through that again. In other words, it could be due to an injury, for example, horse riding, an infection such as vaginitis. It could be nothing, but then it could also be SA. In other words, some prior inappropriate touching, like a pattern of that. And that's 100%. And this is where perspective matters. This is why we need someone like Holly Smith going into JonBenet's room, getting to know this little girl and bringing her perspective into this case. And what we need to do is allocate the correct amount of perspective. Is what we're seeing chronic or extreme? That's in terms of bedwetting. That's in terms of the fecal smearing. That's in terms of the neglect narrative. That's in terms of this idea of the autopsy, what injury we're looking at. That's in terms of all of this. And if what we are seeing can be described as chronic or extreme, then how extreme is it? How chronic is it? If it's not, is it normal? Or is it not present whatsoever? The article goes on to note, Arapahoe County Coroner Dr. Michael Dobison, that's another coroner, says you would need more information before you could come to any conclusion. That was part of Smith's job. And that's also what I've been trying to do, gather context, a lot of context, in order to gain insight. Now, think of what I've just told you, and then this happens, and yeah, we need a loud, ominous bang. But then, according to this article, Holly was abruptly pulled off the investigation and told police who were handling everything. There was a lot of territoriality around the case, Holly said. Now, let me ask you a question. Who do you think pulled Holly off this investigation? Who do you think didn't want them dealing with this particular aspect to the investigation? Who do you think she's talking about when she refers to territoriality? I mean, whose territory, whose case did this end up being? Who called the shots in terms of the Ramsey case at the end of the day? Who decided in which direction this case would go? The article goes on to note, Smith also says she saw things in the Ramsey investigation that she's seen in other cases, like the factor that money played in it. No one is exempt, but people with money are able to keep themselves more cushioned, she says. She says she also saw a reluctance to even consider the issue of child SA. Because Boulder is this perfect town, it's interesting the idea of denial, because it also goes to Kim Archuleta, the 911 operator, who said she heard several voices after Patsy miscradled the phone, and a lab analysis seemed to confirm this. and yet the cops didn't talk to her for weeks, which became months. Was that also part of a deliberate effort not to solve this case? According to the article, Holly Smith said that she believed all of them involved with the case lost their way. That's quite a big statement to make, that all of the investigators just kind of got lost, and I kind of agree with her. I do too. Some theories are better than others, definitely, but I can't say I've heard a single theory from anyone that makes complete sense, that sort of reconciles all the information in a sensible way. And I think it's possibly because it's not including child psychology in the mix. Only 2 dudes from the FBI have cautiously expressed their opinions, Ron Walker and Greg McCreary, in a way that I tend to agree with. Holly then concludes, in all the hyper-personalization around this case, and that is what's going on, people don't see this case in terms of itself. They look at it through their own experience with siblings, with family members, their own relationship with their mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. And that's not really very helpful. And she goes on to say, everybody wanting a piece of it, everybody wanting to be the hero, understandably, and wanting to find out what happened to this little girl, our purpose really got lost. We lost sight of this child. And in order to regain our sight of this child and what happened to JonBenet, what she really experienced, we've got to see it through her perspective. We've got to remember who she was and what her experience was of the world, which is what? Child psychology. And so who was JonBenet? What was her world? Who were her friends? And I think the feces narrative sort of reveals some of that aspect. It's not something we deal with as adults very much unless we have children as well. And although JonBenet, I think, was a happy child, her environment certainly wasn't free of troubles. And in a very basic way, it really wasn't very clean or a very nice environment in a very basic way. Imagine just reaching out for dirty underwear. You don't even have that as a sort of basic right. And who is responsible for a child's sort of clean clothes, when a child is 6 years old? And so the other aspect is, of course, her mother getting cancer during 1 year of her short life. And that had to have been difficult. That had to have been troubling. That had to have been traumatic. That had to have had consequences. I want to conclude by citing a final paragraph from Fox 31's article where they write, in her writing, Holly Smith describes seeing a picture of a smiling JonBenet taken Christmas morning. I think it's perhaps the one with Patsy or under the Christmas tree, and tells how distressing it was to Holly to realize the child would die what she called a hideous death that very day. How true is that? The article concludes saying a lawyer for the Ramsey family did not return our phone calls. The Ramseys have denied that JonBenet suffered any kind of prior SA, and then also noted that her pediatrician, that is Dr. Booth, never saw anything indicating SA either. And of course, that is the bottom line here. No, he didn't, did he? I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.